Dear confreres, on May 2nd, 2021, all of us in India witnessed an extraordinary moment of democratic process as the results of Bengal elections began to pour in. The people of Bengal have rewarded Mrs. Mamata Banerjee and made her the Chief Minister of the state for a third consecutive term. She had mounted a relentless and indefatigable campaign throughout Bengal, which netted an unprecedented 213 seats for her party. Mamata's victory is all the more remarkable because the BJP had turned all its big guns on her defeat, ensuring through the Election Commission an 8-phased election in the middle of a pandemic. Against this muscle, money and use of state machinery, Mamata fought with grit, determination and zeal from a wheelchair till the end. The BJP had to meet its Waterloo in Bengal. As I mentioned the phrase, meeting Waterloo, my mind goes back to the great battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated by the British Army under the Duke of Wellington on June 18, 1815. Napoleon had already led his army of some 72,000 troops against the 68,000 British army, which had taken up a position south of Brussels near the village of Waterloo. The British army, which included Belgian, Dutch and German troops, was commanded by Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, who had gained prominence fighting against the French during the Peninsular War, a man of proactive grit, determination and proactive zeal. Although Napoleon's troops mounted a strong attack against the British, the arrival of the Prussians turned the tide against the French. The French Emperor's outnumbered army retreated in chaos. By some estimates, the French suffered more than 33,000 casualties, including dead, wounded or taken prisoner, while British and Prussian casualties numbered more than 22,000 only. Reportedly, fatigued and poor health during the Belgian campaign, Napoleon committed tactical errors and acted indecisively. He also was blamed for appointing inadequate commanders. Ultimately, the Battle of Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's storied and historical military career. He reportedly rode away from the battle in tears. Wellington went on to serve, on the other hand, as British Prime Minister. Today, the expression that someone has met his Waterloo means the person has suffered a decisive or final defeat or setback. Miss Mamata Banerjee and Duke of Wellington are two great examples of proactive approach. The capacity to face an issue with grit, determination and zeal without being discouraged or reactive amidst difficulties and sufferings. Today, it is time for all of us to take a proactive approach towards missions, especially during this year of missions. As we all know well, Reverend Father Abraham Twelil, our beloved Superior General, through his letter dated May 19, 2021, had declared special year of missions 2021-2022 and inaugurated it on May 23rd. Father General's vision for Year of Missions is stated in his circular. Following the missionary zeal and apostolic boldness of our founder, Father Panthanmackel, and trusting in God who called us into this way of life, we make ourselves available for new apostolic ventures. Some important pointers given in the circular implicitly invite every confrere to grow in proactive missionary zeal and apostolic boldness. We have before us two other great examples of great determination and proactive zeal, namely Saint Francis de Sales, our beloved patron, and servant of God for Peter Mary Marmier, our beloved founder. First, Saint Francis de Sales. Already from the year 1534, the city of Geneva had become the bastion of Protestantism, and Calvin had conquered the whole region. The Catholic faith was suppressed with raids, pillaging, and massacres. Churches were destroyed, worship forbidden, priests exiled or done to death. In Francis' day, the Chablais had been gripped the jaws of Calvinism. Theodore Betza, Calvin's successor, reigned supreme. In obedience to Pope Clement VIII later, he had 3 meetings, Francis de Sales had 3 meetings with Theodore Betza. Calvin's peaceful advances proved uncertain, nay futile. Catholics in Upper Savoy lived in discouragement and dejection. It is at this time Duke Charles Emmanuel, a fervent Catholic, begged Bishop de Granier to send some priests to Chablais, which followed really Calvinist faith. The Duke wanted all his states to be of Catholic faith. He called a meeting of all priests in the town, read His Highness a letter to them, and asked if there were any volunteers for the mission. No one showed readiness. Francis de Sales got up and said, "My Lord, if you think I am capable and will command me, I am ready to obey and will go most willingly." As soon as Monsieur de Boissy, the father of Francis de Sales, heard of this, he became angry and objected to his son's plan. However, Francis realized that it was God's will that he should go to Chablais. Thus he set out towards Chablais along with his cousin Canon Louis on September 9, 1594. Francis' father had forbidden anybody to accompany them, so they carried their own bags and decided to walk all 60 miles, the distance between Annecy and Chablais. When they were a little further along, a friend of Francis lent them horses on which they could cover the distance. Francis arrived in Chablais with a few belongings, among them his breviary, Bellarmine's catechism for his homilies, a Bible for a ready reference and explanation. The young missionary had to face distrust and inflexibility. He was even threatened with menaces and execution for his audacity. However, he, in his initial efforts, set out to gain the goodwill of the simple and humble folk. Francis preached his sermon on Sunday at St. Hippolytus Church just after his reaching there. The subject was a church's authority. When the people of Chablais heard about his sermon, they said that this papist was subtle, eloquent, and dangerous that he was a sort of false prophet and that the only sensible thing to do was to shun him. A meeting of the 4 councillors of the town took place, and they swore an oath that neither they nor the people would ever go to hear him preach. They then hurled hundreds of insults at him, calling him idolater, false prophet, and a canting humbug. After that, Francis and his cousin had only the small group of Catholics as their sole congregation. They met with difficulties one after the other. An attempt was made on Francis' life. On 2 or 3 occasions, a man lay in waiting for him by the roadside and would have killed him with 1 shot had his aim not missed. This fanatic was then convinced that the prophet was protected by some mystic power. On another occasion, the 2 cousins were far from the fortress when night suddenly fell, and they knocked in vain on every door of the village. It was a bitterly cold night, and they huddled up close against each other and awaited the dawn of the day. Another night, Francis was alone in the middle of a wood where the wolves were howling. So he climbed a tree and attached himself with his belt to a branch. This motionless, half-frozen man was found in the morning by some passers-by who, feeling pity for him, brought him to their home to be near the heat. The year of his arrival in Chablais was a long, cold winter, and snow covered the roads. With the crampons fitted to his shoes, Francis covered great distances throughout the countryside. As a result, he got chilblains because of the extreme cold, and his swollen feet became very chapped and split. His suffering doubled when evening came, and he arrived back at the foot of Alinch after hours of walking. The stony, uneven path, which climbs steeply for about 3/4 of a mile, became practically impossible when it was frozen. Francis felt the blood soak, little by little, in his socks, and sometimes the snow was tinted red with each step he took. In the end, unable to continue like that anymore, he reached the top on his hands and knees. Francis continually sought new ways to reach the minds of the people. He began to write brief leaflets, setting forth the leading dogmas of the church as opposed to the tenets of Calvinism. These little papers, on which he worked in spare moments, were copied and recopied by hand and widely distributed. Later, they were collected and printed in a volume called Controversies. In all his difficulties, he was confident that God would one day make them bear fruit. Amidst all his pains, he was never seen disheartened or complaining about his troubles, but always in a gentle and peaceful and proactive mood. He made himself all things to all. As a consequence, the whole of Chablais was converted to Catholic faith. Francis humbly recognized the change and did not hesitate to write Pope Clement VIII that when he arrived in Chablais, he had found only 100 Catholics and now only 100 Protestants. Servant of God, Father Peter Mary Mermier. The servant of God, Father Peter Mary Mermier, the founder of the Missionaries of St. Francis de Sales and of the Congregation of the Daughters of the Holy Cross, was born on August 28, 1790. From his tender years, he had to experience the brutality of the French Revolution. In 1821, he began his parish mission at Les Châtelard, where he himself was parish priest. He wanted to shake the indifference and apathy of the people. He invited a well-known preacher, namely Father Joseph Faber. The mission started on November 18, 1821. 8 days were spent in preaching several sermons a day, held prayers in the church, and visited the families. However, the parishioners remained indifferent. Then Father Mermier and Father Faber went for a few days to a Carthusian monastery to pray and do penance. When they returned, surprisingly, the people came in large numbers to the church, and the mission ended with a renewed fervor among the parishioners. The same method was repeated in other places, and they found it a very successful method: prayer, penance, and preaching. Dear confreres, the mission preaching will never be successful and fruitful if we do not commit ourselves to a life of prayer and penance, and unless we learn the spirit of self-sacrifice. When Bishop D. Theolus died at the age of 80 in March 1832, the missionaries of St. Francis de Sales lost a father who encouraged and helped their first steps. On July 2nd, 1832, a new bishop, Monsignor Pierre Joseph Ray, was appointed in his place. After his taking charge on October 2nd, 1832, Father Mermier and Father Allard came to see him and requested his approval for the young congregation. The bishop asked them to wait for some more time. Father Mermier was ready to wait, but his companions were not ready for that. Father Allard and Father Revillard left the group immediately. Even Father Jacques Martin is a close companion, and he spoke of giving up. Imagine a situation, the close friends moving away, feeling a kind of betrayal. Mermier must have felt really agonized. In such a hard situation, Father Mermier wanted to continue the missions with the words, "My friend, you are free. See for yourself what decision you have to take. If you leave me after 10 years of trial, I will remain all alone. But my resolution is unshakable, as also my desires. I want missions." On January 30, 1842, Bishop Ray died in Annecy at the age of 72. He wanted to ask the Holy See's approval for the MSFS congregation, but died before he could do that. On September 20th, Father Mermier went to meet Canon Louis Rendu, who had just been appointed Bishop of Annecy. He told the bishop of his letter to Rome. Bishop Rendu immediately urged him to go fast and go personally to Rome in order to obtain the required approval for the congregation. Father Mermier arrived in Rome on September 30, 1842 and found lodgings with the Basilian fathers and started contacting people for getting his work done. Having no friends at Rome, he came up against the closed doors. During the long wait, Father Mermier continued very patiently to take the necessary steps. On June 2nd, 1843, based on a favorable report given by Cardinal Ferretti, the prefect of the Sacred Congregation of Bishops and Religious, conferred on the humble founder and his institute the decree of praise. Some of the letters which he wrote to his confreres in Annecy from Rome contains his tryst with the patients. He wrote to Father Chaminal, the beginnings were terrible. However, Father Mermier was never tired of doing what is right. He persisted with his request to Rome for approbation of the constitution in patience, humility, and with proactive zeal. The first MSFS missionaries left their homeland on June 5, 1845 and landed at Pondicherry on September 8 at the age of a voyage of 90 days. The missionaries were Father Jacques Martin, Father Joseph Labore, Father Jean Tissot, Father Jean Thévenet, Brother Pierre Carton, and Brother Sulpice Fontanel. Almost after 6 months, on February 15, the pioneers reached Yanam. After installing Father Martin as parish priest of Yanam, the rest of the confreres continued their journey and reached Visakhapatnam on February 19, 1846. On May 5, 1846, Father Jacques Martin, one of the close founding companions, as I said, of Father Mermier and the first superior of Visakhapatnam mission, died at Yanam. A great tragedy that Mermier had to experience in his own life. Father Martin fell ill on May 2nd, probably due to sunstroke. In his last 2 hours of life, he continued to be calm and serene. He seemed to be continually praying. His eyes were ever turned towards heaven. He breathed his last as though he had fallen into a calm and peaceful sleep. Saint Francis Zeal and servant of God for Peter Mermier followed the footsteps of the 2 great apostles and proactive missionaries, Saint Peter and Saint Paul, whose solemnity we celebrate today. In the passage from St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, 13 to 19, Peter makes a proactive confession of faith in Jesus, acknowledging him as Messiah and Son of God. In reply, the Lord reveals to him the mission that he intends to assign to him, that of being the rock, the visible foundation on which the entire spiritual edifice of the church is built. But in what sense is Peter the rock? The acknowledgement of Jesus' identity made by Simon in the name of the 12 did not come through flesh and blood, that is, through his human capacities, but through a particular revelation and inspiration from God the Father. By contrast, immediately afterwards, as Jesus foretells his passion, death and resurrection, Simon Peter would react on the basis of flesh and blood. He began to take a reactive approach, saying, "This shall never happen to you." And Jesus in turn replied, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me." The disciples who, through God's gift, was able to become a solid rock, here shows himself what he is in his human weakness. Here we see the tension that exists between the gift that comes from the Lord and human capacities. Here we see an anticipation of the troubled history of the papacy itself. The joint presence of these 2 elements, human weakness and divine power. Remember, they are all the time at play in our own lives too. Human weakness and divine power. Peter and Paul shed their blood for Christ, but the early community as a whole also experienced persecution. As actually apostles testifies. Today, in various parts of the world, great numbers of Christians are marginalized, vilified, discriminated against, subjected to violence and even death. The Apostle Paul speaks of being poured out as a libation. 2 Timothy chapter 4:6. As a faithful disciple, Paul thus followed the Master and proactively offered his own life too. Dear confreres, apart from the cross, there is no Christ. Apart from the cross, there can be no Christian either. For Christian virtue is not only a matter of doing good, but of imitating Jesus Christ, proactively carrying our burden, shouldering it for his sake, and that of others in prayer. In the church, it is prayer that sustains us and helps us to overcome difficulties. We see this too in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter was in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made with God by the church. A church that prays is watched over and cared for by the Lord. A congregation that prays is watched over and cared for by the Lord. A person that prays is watched over and cared for by the Lord. When we pray, we entrust our lives to Him and His loving care. May the blessed apostles obtain for us a heart like theirs, wearied yet at peace, thanks to proactive prayer. Prayer is a proactive exercise. During this year of missions, let us pay heed to the very words of our dear founder by becoming persons led by the Spirit of God, who proactively pray, study and mortify. Then we will definitely be more loving and proactively zealous missionaries whose mission will be to proclaim Jesus' love to all.